7 million Americans marched for freedom. 57% of Americans detest Donald Trump. And you know what? It's not nearly enough. Our work has barely begun. I'm Marshall Herskovitz.
I'm Nick Knudsen.
And we're back on the Rising, where we look squarely in the face of the biggest challenge Americans have faced since World War II. This generation will not let America fail. Let's get started.
Let's go.
All right. Here we go. We had a week off where we weren't able to do the show, and I'm so excited to be back. And the responses to the show have been really amazing.
They have.
Telling the truth of how bad it is, but also saying we will not let it remain that bad.
Yeah.
And the idea of this show, again, is to look at the past and say Americans did amazing things. And they weren't like from some other planet. They were in your family. They were your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. They did amazing things. And we're going to have to do amazing things now. We're going to have to reach down deep. And that's the purpose of the show, is to talk about how that can be done.
Yeah, and we're super excited for this show today. We've had a lot of really interesting conversations, just the two of us. But we decided now's a moment where let's bring some other voices into the conversation. So
absolutely. Today we have one of the most exciting Democrats I've seen in many years, Jake Auchincloss, a representative from Massachusetts, who has a million brilliant ideas and is really making a name for himself. And I hope you'll really listen to what he has to say. Jake was born and raised in Newton, Massachusetts, my old stomping grounds, the son of a surgeon and a scientist. After graduating from Harvard, what did he do? He joined the Marines. He commanded troops in Afghanistan and Panama. Jake's been a businessman, a city councilor, has multiple degrees from Harvard and MIT, and is now a third-term congressman from Massachusetts' 4th District. Welcome to The Rising, Jake Auchincloss.
Thanks for having me on.
So, here we are in this amazing moment in America when everything's going so wonderfully. Congress is shut down, a million things. I guess the question that's on the top of our minds is the Democrats are in the worst place they've been in a very, very long time. And a lot of voices are shouting and babbling and mumbling about, how the Democrats are going to come together. Would love to get your thoughts just at the beginning of this. Just, do you see a path, and what would that path be for the Democrats to have a coherent vision that Americans would embrace?
Starts with understanding what I think is intuitive probably to both of you as storytellers and producers of cultural works, which is that culture is upstream of politics. MAGA has understood this for a decade. Democrats too often want to talk about policy in political spaces. And by the time you're doing that, if you've lost the culture war, no campaign can save you. And in order to regain the cultural mainstream of America, we have to have a theory of the good life. What does it mean to improve as a country? What does it mean to improve as a person? Until we can articulate that, I don't think that voters can hear us on the specific policies.
I think that's really smart. I mean, there are these different factions in the Democratic Party right now that see a possibility of what a good life would be, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. And I think, look, I personally have been doing a deep dive in the kinds of things you've been talking about and what you stand for, and really incredibly impressed by how smart and how sort of thought out everything is. I think there's a question that people want to know because they want to put people in pigeonholes. Okay. So you have progressives, you have moderates, or centrists, that sort of thing. You have socialists. The question is, how do you bring all those people together? And I think a follow-on question to that is that if a person is a moderate or a centrist, I think in the terms of the Democratic Party, in a lot of ways, that's become suspicious for a lot of people, because I think, one of my sort of subjects that I harp on all the time is neoliberalism, and the fact that neoliberalism has had such an influence on American politics for the last 40 years, and that so much of what you would call centrist democratic politics has in some way connected itself to corporate money and the need for corporate money and what corporations want. So is there a path for what you would call a moderate vision? And I think we want to talk about what that means, because it can mean a lot of things that are quite wonderful. But is there a path for that would disassociate itself from this incredible influence of corporate money or neoliberal sort of policies that have, I think, in some way harmed the way people look at the Democrats, especially working people?
Yes, it requires first that we as a party are able to define a new center. If we get stuck in a stale tug of war between the 2015 definition of a moderate and a 2015 definition of a progressive, we're going to lose. Because what has happened since 2016 is the electorate has realigned. MAGA has successfully built out a multi-ethnic working class coalition. Now, I don't think they're going to keep it because they're failing to deliver on their promises, and they are harassing elements of that coalition through their egregious actions with ICE. But they were able to build it. And with a realigned electorate, the key to controlling the terms of debate is to define a new center and connect that new center to our theory of the good life. And that means dragging and dropping good ideas from across the factions of American ideology. From traditional conservatives, who, by the way, have been orphaned by MAGA, their reverence for faith, family, and the flag. I think we should be a party that supports marriage and family and wanting people to travel along that success sequence of getting married, having children, and that stake of optimism in the future that starting a family really entails. I think we can take from populists their hostility towards corporate capture, particularly oriented towards social media corporations, and how they've become the most powerful, the most wealthy corporations in the history of the world by corroding our civil discourse and attention fracking our youth. We can take from libertarians their suspicion of centralized and personalized executive power. I mean, this president wants to be a king. And there has always been a healthy strain amongst free Americans that says, we're not going to quarter the king's troops 250 years ago, and we're not going to quarter the president's troops now. This guy is not the commander-in-chief of the American police force.
Yeah.
And so assuming that you can sort of pull all of these sort of different elements from different political factions across the country and package them into a coherent sort of platform that the Democrats can run on, how do you get that message out in an atmosphere where social media corporations are owned by people who are clearly like in the pocket of Donald Trump, and the algorithms are against us at every step? How do you get that message out?
A fusion of talent, ideas, and courage. Those are the three things that are required for a successful mobilization of American public opinion. And first is the ideas. We have not put forward as a party or as a Congress ideas for how we're going to wrest back control of our in real life community from the rapacious greed of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and TikTok, which is owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And I've put forward legislation in Congress, happy to dive into the policy details, but to suffice to say, the social media corporations hate it because it makes them liable for their actions. It taxes them after their years of international shell games. And it puts parents in the driver's seat of how their kids are being monetized by these algorithms. We take those ideas. We have the courage to challenge not just Republicans who are totally in bed with the tech lobby, but also Democrats who have been too slow to move against these corporations. And we put this platform behind candidates who can engage both in real life and, ironically, through these existing social media channels that do matter for distribution, but that are not being treated like just a bulletin board, but rather like a backstage pass to create trust and authentic connection.
Since we're talking about social media, let's just continue along this, because this is something we both over here wanted to talk about quite a bit.
Yeah.
First of all, for our viewers, talk about, I think it's called Rule 230 or Section 230.
Sure.
Talk about the significance of that and what you want to do with it, because I think that's the doorway to a lot of things we want to talk about.
Happy to. Can I just take one step even further back before I do that? Because I'm happy to address Section 230. But maybe just taking a step further back, why am I so hostile to social media? I think a lot of us experience social media in our daily lives. I think some people have an intuition about its effects on our society, but I think it's useful to be just very clear about what's happening here. The human brain really is sensitive to hits of dopamine. 600 million years ago, when the brain first began to evolve and the little nematode worms in the ocean, the first thing that those neurons were able to do was use dopamine signals to go towards food. So this has been with us for a long time. And the dopamine reinforcement circuit is all about expecting pleasure and then getting pleasure. And boy, are we oriented towards that loop. Online gambling takes advantage of that loop. Pornography takes advantage of that loop. Drugs in general take advantage of that loop. Social media is probably the most effective intervention yet invented of taking advantage of the dopamine reinforcement circuit. And these companies are basically miners and merchants of dopamine in the human brain. It's by far the most valuable drug in the world. And we have no rules. So let's now go to Section 230. Section 230 was a law passed in the 1990s that basically said for these, what was then called interactive computer services, now we would call social media, that they're not liable for third-party content posted on their servers. And you know what? In the 1990s, when the internet was trying to get off the ground, and it was like a bunch of blogs about recipes, maybe that made sense. It's 2025, the internet's doing pretty darn good, and I don't think they need this blanket immunity anymore. And what they're doing is they're taking advantage of that blanket immunity to now engineer chatbots that, according to Meta, should be able to have, quote, sensual conversations with 12-year-olds. This law is enabling these corporations to pursue the 7 deadly sins for profit, and we need to reform it to hold them liable to the American people.
Let me ask you a question. This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech.
Yes.
But in what we call the public square, which has had a lot of meanings through history, there's never been freedom of speech in the public square. In other words, not only can you not stand up in a theater and yell fire, you also can't stand up in a theater in the middle of a play and start shouting what your political views are. You can't walk naked down the city street. No reputable newspaper in America is going to publish an op-ed by someone who works for Russian intelligence or someone who's an avowed Nazi. There are all kinds of ways in which historically the public square has not been guaranteed free speech in America. And yet now the public square exists entirely of social media that's entirely unregulated. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I might put it in the way that Jonathan Haidt, the author of Anxious Generation, has said, which is freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. So you have a right to go post whatever you want. It can be something that I hate. It can be something hateful. It can, call me a knucklehead, call Donald Trump a knucklehead, whatever. We have a very expansive definition of First Amendment, particularly political speech in this country. That is separate and apart from the editorial decision that the algorithms themselves are making about what kind of speech to amplify and what kind of speech to suppress. The tech companies want to claim, and they've said this to me directly, they'll say, Jake, we're just booksellers, all right? Other people write the books, we host the books in our bookstore, and people can buy the book or they cannot buy the book. That's complete rubbish. They're not just booksellers, okay? Their decision about what to amplify or suppress is moving the bookshelves all around. And actually, Americans have long regarded libraries as a public good, and we regard what's on the shelves as of public concern, and those algorithms cannot be private property. They need to be transparent, there needs to be data interoperability, there needs to be portability across the platforms, and those algorithms need to be subject to the American public's oversight because it affects all of us.
We see a lot of folks are talking about the idea of making algorithms transparent in some way. I'm sure there are legal issues with that, but it seems to me that it's sort of analogous to, when you buy a package of food, it has now a little thing on the side telling you what's in the food. I mean, don't we have the same right with algorithms?
Yeah, and I'll give two specific examples of that. One is, I think that we should have Consumer Product Safety Commission actually issue guidance and standards around the apps that adolescents use. The same way that if you're a parent and you're buying a bicycle helmet for your kid, the Consumer Product Safety Commission will say this bicycle helmet works. We tested it, we think it works. Same kinds of guidance and informational guardrails put around an app, whether it's an online gambling app, a social media app, so that parents understand what are the effects of this app on my adolescents' dopamine system and their developing brain, because the brain at that age is very plastic, very sensitive to these corporate interventions. And we know how these companies make money, which is keeping your kid glued to the screen 6 to 8 hours a day, to the effect that now the average American child spends less time outdoors than a federal inmate. That is where these companies have taken our youth. Another example is there's a great new proposal put forward called the First Person Project, which is trying to create social media that is de-anonymized, where people have verifiable identities and are connecting based on affinity groups with verifiable identities. I think this is so important to knitting together our civic fabric online.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to the conversation that we had last week, Marshall, or last episode, where we were talking about sort of with each stage of evolution of America, there's been sort of a redefinition of freedom as we go, right? When they wrote the Constitution, they said everybody would be equal, but they built slavery into the equation, and so over time, America sort of resets its definition of what freedom is. I argue that we're not. There is an encroachment on our freedom as humans from these social media companies. It's wanting to change the situation is not like anti-tech. It's pro-freedom. Like a freedom from manipulation.
By the way, freedom from.
I think that's very well put.
Introduced. Yeah.
I call it free minds. Free minds, just like we believe in free enterprise, we believe in free elections, believe in free minds. And that's not just freedom of worship or freedom of speech. That also means freedom from that kind of algorithmic manipulation. And I totally agree that this is not some kind of Luddite anti-tech reaction. I was the director of MIT's entrepreneurship competition. Just this morning, I was at their Tough Tech conference. Like, you're talking about industrial robots, you're talking about fusion power, we're talking about genetically engineered therapies for cancer. Like, bring it on. Let's bring technology on, make life better, lower costs. But that's different than Mark Zuckerberg's claim that he wants kids to have AI friends. I have 3 little kids. I want them to have real friends.
Yep.
And beyond, and I totally agree, and I've got kids too, and I'm very concerned about that. But beyond just the sort of adolescence angle, like, we are where we are as a country right now because of these social media algorithms. Like, they have stoked fear and anger, rage, and the algorithms are built to feed that because those kinds of emotions keep people on these platforms. So even just from a political perspective, they're exceptionally problematic.
It's amazing. Jake, you know this, but I think most people don't know this, that across the board, 65 to 75% of Americans agree on literally almost any issue you can name, whether it's taxes, climate, even trans issues,
abortion,
race, abortion. It goes on and on and on. In fact, America is in many ways less polarized now than at any time, back to the 1950s. And yet here we are supposedly about to be in a civil war. I mean, you can make the case that this is entirely the result of, social media and also the weaponization of news media.
Mm-hmm.
For the same thing. In other words, to maximize engagement. In that case, it's ratings, but it's the same thing. Basically,
all for corporate profit.
That basically they are selling rage, and
it's outrage as a service, and I agree with you, Marshall. It has meant that we are tribal but not polarized.
Exactly. Thank you. That's a great way of putting it. That's it.
An unprecedented situation for us as a country, but also a political opportunity to define a new center that says to the exhausted majority, like, hey, get together in real life, look around, there's a deep reservoir of common sense and decency, and we actually don't hate each other. When you're behind your keyboard, you do, but when you're actually talking to somebody, as I did last week with a bunch of young Republicans, for example, what you find is, to your point, Marshall, like taxes and even the thorny stuff, like what are the combat standards for women in the military? You drive to common ground very quickly.
Very quickly. Yeah. Amazingly quickly. Yeah.
We just have to unhack our minds somehow. and I think what you're talking about is legislatively is the right course.
Yeah. I mean,
can I just point to one other element that you had said earlier, Nick, that they're driving for profit by keeping people sort of mad at each other. It's actually, to me, so far, it's been mostly a media phenomenon. It's going to start becoming an economic phenomenon in the sense that increasingly people are going to be defined by whether they're above the API or below the API, which is to say, like, either the algorithm's controlling you, like it's telling you whom to pick up if you're an Uber driver, or what to, how to do your job because you are being sort of dictated to by AI, or you're the one producing the content or giving the directions to the algorithm. That is going to be a very unhealthy economic divide in our country.
This is horrifying.
Really exacerbate
existing
inequality.
That's really horrifying.
Yeah.
You're right.
You are right.
You're right.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the questions I have going back to the Democrats is there's the industry of rage, but then there's a whole other thing, which is that millions of Americans, but on the right and the left, are enraged at what I call the neoliberal sort of reign of the last 35 years. And, when you look at the horrible thing that happened when the CEO of United Healthcare was assassinated and people's reactions to that, of course, we have to say that's a horrible thing, but you also have to look at it and say, why were so many people, rejoicing at that? And you have to understand how so many millions of Americans feel powerless in their lives right now. That this system, I won't call it government. It's a cultural system. This neoliberal reign that basically says that profit is everything, public good is nothing, has made people feel entirely powerless. And I guess the question I have for you, and this is a political question really, is that kind of rage. I'm not talking about the merchants of rage. I'm talking about the actual righteous rage that people feel that something's been taken away from them, is a very powerful motivator in elections. And it's really worked for Donald Trump. We know that, okay? And I wonder if there's a way, I shouldn't say a way, I wonder if it's not correct for the Democrats to embrace that rage, to say, this has really caused harm. This has caused enormous harm. It's hollowed out the middle class of America. By the way, Nick, you had this graph a couple of weeks ago that was so astonishing of what it meant to be middle class in 1965 versus what it means to be middle class today, and how little sort of discretionary income people have today, especially if they're working class. So these harms are real. Okay, so the question is, I come back to this question of the center. Okay, the center doesn't necessarily mean you're not angry. There are things to actually be angry about. I agree with you. You have to have solutions that get us away or get us to another place from where we're angry, that empower us in some way. But I have this feeling that the Democratic Party has been split a little bit by the people who say we are angry and we want to change things, and the people who say let's make peace and let's sort of do things the way they used to be done before. I think there has to be some kind of amalgamation of these two points of view that embraces that anger, but in a way that says, okay, how can we create the new version of America that empowers people to create their lives and feel that they have agency in their lives. Does this make sense to you?
Agency for sure. And I think that needs to be central to our conception of what the good life is. It's financial freedom, and it is in real life community where you feel in control, where you feel like your decisions and your effort have real impact on your life. And when you take that sense of control away from people, it is enraging, rightfully so. We've seen from MAGA where rage without solutions can lead us, right? It leads to crony capitalism and corruption at a scale that the United States has never seen before. And we should be angry about that. We should be angry about a middle class that is suffocating. But we have to have a theory of the case that actually points towards solutions. And I think there are at least three elements within this theory of the case. I think we've got to treat cost disease in housing and healthcare, because when you actually look at what is taking out the middle class, it is housing and healthcare. That is what is eating their discretionary income. We've got to address the rampant corruption, not just of this president, but also that has suffused the entire electoral system, whether it's partisan primaries, whether it's gerrymandered seats, whether it is the role of unbridled money in politics. We need to take it on head on and be willing to challenge our own side. And then finally, and neither party has addressed this in the last 5 years, we have to talk about education in classrooms. Okay, the school closures in 2020 were a catastrophe. They were a catastrophe for the middle class and the working class. And there can be no financial freedom. There can be no sense of agency if we are allowing our children to backslide on the critical thinking capabilities that they need.
Absolutely.
It's really, really well put. I mean, for years I've thought that this cannot be solved by policies and regulations alone. It has to be a cultural movement. It has to be a cultural movement toward reform. I mean, it's amazing to me, one of the things we talk about on this show is the fact that I'm old and I was around and I saw things that a lot of people today were not born yet. And the notion that America would be a corrupt country was unthinkable when I was young. I mean, there was corruption. Of course there was corruption. There were bad actors but our institutions, I mean, the entire world looked to the United States as a beacon, not just of hope, but of what it meant to have a system that worked. And the idea that we are now in many ways a corrupt country, that our economy is corrupt, our politics are corrupt, our media is corrupt, it's horrible. And I think unless we find a way to build a movement, which is an emotional thing. So it's not just regulations and rules. It's funny, Nick and I were talking a couple weeks ago, and I did this little thought experiment because I talk a lot about what things were like post-war, post-World War II. That was the greatest period of growth in American history. And a lot of people say, well, that was because we had no competition from foreign countries and we had all these GIs who wanted to work and build families and all that. But there was something else going on at that time, which was that everybody who ran America's corporations in the 1950s and the 1960s had either fought in World War II or had helped run the war effort in World War II. And they had internalized this idea that you put your country first. Like Kennedy said, ask what you can do for your country. And there was this ethic. I think that's why they were willing to put up with regulations. They were willing to put up with a 91% top marginal tax rate. There were a lot of things that capitalists were willing to do in the 50s and 60s that would be unthinkable today. So I suggested this thought experiment. It sort of imagine basically a parallel universe where it's 1958, but Facebook exists and it has 1 billion users like now. Okay. And imagine in 1958, if it came out that Mark Zuckerberg had hired addiction experts to get kids hooked on the algorithm and knew that it was destroying their mental health and their educations and
it was intentional.
And was intentional.
Right.
Knew it and still did it. Okay. Imagine if that came out in 1958, I guarantee you he would have had to resign by the next day. That would have been intolerable behavior for the leader of a large company in 1958 in America. So we have to ask ourselves, that's where I get to this idea of a cultural shift, that we have to somehow bring back, a lot of things that have forgotten about what we stood for as a people, not just our laws, but our values and how you talk about that.
I agree. And I think that one of the other changes that has happened in that time period is the rise of postmodernism and relativism that basically started to make the critique starting in the 60s and 70s that there was no such thing as truth, and that all statements of truth were really just statements of power and differential power. And it began in sort of edges of the faculty lounge, but has since become one of the dominant paradigms of a lot of elite institutions. It has been to our detriment as a country. There is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as right and wrong. And when you allow people to have that relativistic moral structure, what you're doing is you're letting everybody chart their own adventure for how they behave. And we can't have an in real life community like that, particularly in a country like America that is so boisterous and individualistic. We need to have some common structure.
Yeah. 100%.
Absolutely.
100%. It's funny. It's like I've been saying this for 7 or 8 years, that in many ways I see myself as a conservative in a very particular way, that without changing any of my opinions, that I always was a conservative. I just didn't know that was conservative. I want to conserve the values that made America great, and it's really clear now as we see our institutions being destroyed, a lot of Democrats are conservatives in that way. And I think what you're talking about is these norms that are, these rules, the sense of order that keeps society together, I think are essential. And people have to come together, as you like to say, in real life to bring these norms back.
Well, hopefully next time we talk, it can be in real life.
That would be great.
That would
be great.
I hope so.
We can't thank you enough for this conversation.
Yeah.
Appreciate you having me on.
It's great.
Yep.
Yeah. That guy is really exciting.
Yeah, he's really smart.
He's really, really smart.
Yeah.
If you read what he's written,
I know,
and watch him in his other appearances, I mean, he has such command of facts and figures, but also is able to put them toward a goal of creating a new vision for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and he's
very exciting.
He's focusing on the right things. I love how passionate he is about regulating social media companies, because I feel strongly about that. So.
Absolutely. And I think also he's very brave. Let's face it, he is saying things that other Democrats do not have the guts to say, and they've got to say. And he says them with grace and with intelligence. And you know what? We need more like him.
We do. Why don't you tell us what you think? You can call us on the People's Hotline at 503-212-4600. You can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and leave up to a 5-minute message and remain anonymous. You can also email us at shout@thedangerousones.com. Go to www.thedangerousones.com. That'll kick you over to our Substack, where we'll have a deeper dive about today's conversation and some of this stuff about social media regulation. So definitely check that out. Be sure to subscribe to our audio podcast by going to the links in the description. And if you'd like to help the Rising grow, you can scan the QR code on your screen, or you can go to the link in the description. It helps us out so much.
Thank you, Nick. As always, this was such a huge pleasure, and it's such a privilege to be able to speak to people in this way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Feel the same way. And thank all of you. Remember, if we think big, meet fear with courage, and build community, we can all rise together. Bye.